Okay. Okay. Well, I've still got some people listening down the side of my screen. I hope you can see the full screen, which can you see it all, or um, are you missing the right-hand side of the screen? Is that all right? It should say Norman fonts, the East Riding after the conquest. Have you got that?
Yeah, we can
Yes,
see. I can see
I've
one.
got that.
Yeah, if
I had to
people,
fish around a bit to get
if
the
people have
differences.
still got faces on the right hand side,
Yes.
if you just press the little line at the top, it would reduce that. If you do it individually yourself on your own computer, that should get rid of that for you because it's each.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. Now then, well, I'm confining this talk to Norman fonts and the East Riding for reasons which will become clear because there are so many of them. But it's basically the East Riding after the conquest. In the century or so after the conquest, the visual experience of the Christian changed. Now, although there was, of course, an influx of Norman lords, the vast majority of the population were, of course, Anglo-Saxon. It wasn't like freedom of movement in the common market. So we're looking at a change almost in the visual culture. And fonts were part of that. So let's start with a bit of context of background. Now, as we all know, William the Conqueror came over in 1066 and began his conquest of England. In 1069, there was an uprising in the north of the country, and this led him to come up to North and places, York and places north, and begin a sense of economic warfare, which was called the Harrowing of the North, where he laid waste to the countryside. And that is reflected, as we can see, in Domesday Book, where the value of the land, the economic potential of the land changed dramatically in the East Riding. And the lordships, of course, also changed dramatically. And one thing William was able to do, of course, was to reward his Norman associates with land, grants of land in England. Many of them didn't actually come to England, but it was income-producing assets. And then he also recruited in 1070 Bishop Lanfranc, became Archbishop of Canterbury and transformed the English church. Now let's start off with the evidence we've got for the harrowing of the North in this particular area. So this is Domesday Book for North Grimston. Broadly speaking, it tells you that the lords, so the king was the holder of the land, and then it was granted. The Archbishop of York had land at North Grimston, although that was part of a large estate that had been in the hands of the archbishops for some time. And then Hugh, son of Baldric, was also a landholder there. Now, its value in 1066, I'm going to have to try and remove a few people because I can't read all this. Okay, so how do I get rid of you? Okay, no. Was £14. And in 1086, it was 10 shillings. So the reduction in the productive capacity of the land was huge over that 20 years. Now, that, of course, meant that the whole program that we're going to be talking about of rebuilding of churches, of re-equipping them and so on, started from a base where the countryside was much less productive than it had been. But we'll wind back and we'll start by looking at the churches that were around before the great Norman rebuilding of the Saxon churches. Now, there aren't many complete Anglo-Saxon churches remaining in England. This very early one is Escombe in County Durham, and it's almost completely built from reused Roman stone. Now, that is about 670 to 680, so that's 7th century. And again, another example of reuse of Roman stone and brick is Bradwell in Essex. Now, this was built about 660 to 62, and that's only 60 years after St. Augustine came in to become the Archbishop of Canterbury and to bring formalized Christianity to what was then a pagan country, which was Britain. Interestingly, we think of Anglo-Saxon buildings as being of wood, and here is one. So this is the nave of the church at Greenstead in Essex, and structurally it's made of cleaved oak. Ignore the dainty dormer windows, which are Victorian addition, but the dating of the oak gives us a much later date of 1060. So the churches that were here were, generally speaking, as far as we know, used wood rather than newly dressed stone. And what stone there was Roman, but we haven't got that many complete churches to go by. So the one of the things that the new Norman lords did, encouraged by Lanfranc, who was a great reformer of the church, was to start to rebuild, and in some cases it was monastic investment, churches in the later Norman style. And we'll start by having a look at one church that we can date securely. Now, this is Weaverthorpe, and we know from an inscription on the church that it was built by Herbert the Chamberlain, who was Chamberlain to Henry I, and the probable date for the build is around 1109 to 1119. Now, in 1121, his son, who was St. William of York, gave the church to the Augustinian canons at Nostell. So we've got a fairly fixed date for this one. Now, there is a font in there, which we'll look at later, but just to think about the generations, so that the people baptized in the font in that church would have been 2 generations at most from the Norman conquest. You're looking at a population, a native population, that will still have strong memories of the way in which the church was organized, and indeed the church buildings and the visual experience of Christianity was organized 2 generations before. Here's the interior of Weaverthorpe, which has been thoroughly sykesed. I mean, most fortunately, they didn't touch the structure. It was fairly sensitively done. Most of it is additions by very, very high quality Victorian craftsmen. Regrettably, as ever with these Sykes churches, they took up the floor and replaced it with tiles. Now, we're talking about fonts this evening, and we're talking about the sacrament of baptism, what that meant to the individual, and partly what that meant to the way in which the church was organized. So baptism welcomed the individual into the church. And traditionally, the font is the first thing you see, a bit of first church furniture you see on entering the church. And traditionally, it stood alone at the west end of the nave. So the placing of the font like that could guide the viewer interpreting its message, because almost all the fonts we're looking at today are circular. I mean, in other areas you have square fonts, but the same applies, that to get the full impact of the message of the font, and most of them carried a message, you would need to go round it. So it needed to be freestanding, it needed space around it. Now let's just start with looking at the surviving Norman fonts that we have in East Yorkshire. And you'll forgive the fairly scrappy map. Now, these are modern parishes. To the best of our knowledge, this was clearly not the way in which parishes were organised, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon period, where it seemed to correspond more to lordships. And certainly there was a reorganization of parishes later on in the 12th century, but these are modern parishes and modern boundaries, but I've just used it as being a handy way of locating the fonts in the churches that survive. And one thing that jumps out at you immediately is that the major proportion of the surviving Norman fonts are up in the uplands, in the less productive chalk country, in the wolds, which of course, until the agricultural revolution, was a very poor area. So this was not an economically very productive area, unlike, say, around Beverley and around the Holderness and in the Vale of York, where during the Middle Ages and later, there was much more prosperity and much more economic activity. That means, of course, it's not that there weren't Norman fonts down there. It means that there was the money to replace them with later ones. So these are the survivors, and there are 63 that I know of altogether. And I'd be happy if anybody could tell me if there are any more than that, because they are fascinating artifacts. So they come in basically 5 designs, and almost always in this area of Yorkshire, they are circular. There are just a few that are geometric, octagonal, but mostly they're circular. There's the plain circular font that we're all very familiar with. There are arcaded fonts, which basically replicate architectural styles. There are geometric fonts. There are figurative fonts. And probably later, towards the end of the period, you get clustered columns, and usually in fairly high status churches, those. So let's have a look, first of all, at where the Anglo-Saxon, the sort of experience the Anglo-Saxon would have had of an Anglo-Saxon font. This is from Deerhurst. It's one of the very few surviving Anglian fonts. And as you can see, the style of carving is not regular, it's not geometric, it's organic. And this is very characteristic, of course, of this style. So let me just go on. So here we have, in its correct position, a plain tub font. This is at Wintringham. This font was actually, it's where it was originally, but in 1880s, they re-roofed the church and did a lot of work to it, which involved taking out the font, taking out all the 17th century pews, but they did faithfully put them back where they had been. So there is the south door. You come in, and the first thing you see is the font, and you can go round it. The priest's step is at the back, although I note with this particular font that the priest's step is actually a grave slab with a Calvary on it, but we'll draw a veil over that. That's obviously a later addition. And here is what happens when you reorganize a church. And so here is the the Weaverthorpe font, around about 1120, geometric carving, firmly moved from its original position and tucked away in the naughty corner, which is just in the northwest. And were that, in fact, you can't see the whole of the thing going round because the geometric pattern changes as you go round the font, which is very difficult to do now. So we're looking at how you decorate the surface of your font, remembering that all these Norman fonts are large. And the reason for that is that baptism was total immersion. So children were dunked in the font. There was none of this picking up of a little bit of water and pouring it over their heads. And in fact, later on, we'll see an actual representation of a baptism like that. Now, it's likely that the fonts were painted. In fact, there's good evidence to suggest that. Did the plain drum fonts carry figure painting? We have no idea. There's no documentary evidence about it at all. Were relief carved fonts also painted? I would guess so, given that other parts of the church were painted. Even at Escombe, there is decoration on the chancel arch, and that's 670. Whether or not it's contemporaneous, I'm not quite sure. But here we have, on the naughty step in the northwest corner, the Seaton Ross plain tub font. But this tells us that it was once painted. It's very difficult to see here, but there are remains on the stonework of plaster, of gesso. And that indicates that it was once painted. Now, if you try and paint straight onto stone, the paint just soaks in. So you have to cover the stone with a thin coat of plaster and glue in order to provide a ground for the paint to stick and to produce the right colours. So that has the remains of some plaster. Obviously, everything's worn off by now, but that suggests that it was once painted. No idea what the pattern was. Here we have the font at Sherburn. Now, this is an arcaded font, and each arcade is filled with a stylized tree. But there is one arcade which is left blank. And I'd suggest that this would have been, of course, painted, and so there would have been painting of the arcades and the trees, and the blank arcade would have been left, presumably, for some kind of figure painting, whether it was the patronal saint or something else, I don't know. But the capacity to do it is there. Now, on the subject of arcaded fonts, the arcading is an obvious architectural feature. Now, this wonderful font is from Bessingby. It's near Bridlington. And it's arcades infilled, almost all of it, with geometric designs, although here we have two Romanesque lions, and there is the foliate carving. But here we see the capitals of the columns, we see the Norman arches, we see the geometric carving of the columns, and you will all know Durham Cathedral, of which this is a composite picture. Now, I cannot believe that the man who made Bessingby font had not seen some church or other with that kind of decoration, because going back, it looks like a large church in miniature. So this is, I suppose, conceptually, that would be the font as the church into which you were adopted when you were baptized. Now,
can you give it a stir, check it's all right?
Okay. Another arcaded font. And this is interesting because, of course, fonts aren't always in their original location. Now, this comes from Warren Percy. And the photographs of the original excavations at Warren Percy show that it was in the church in the 1950s, sitting, looking rather miserable at the end. And in the late 50s, it was moved, and it was moved to a modern church in Hull, St. Michael's Church, where it now is. Now, it's not the only font that survives from a lost village. So, for example, the village of Argham, which is north of Grindale and is now lost, its font is now in Grindale Church. Cottam, which again is a lost village, its font and some other stonework from the church is now at Langtoft. And Auburn Church, which disappeared under the waves, coastal erosion, is now at Ragby Church in West Yorkshire. Cowlham, although the font is still in its church, although not the original church, of course, a Victorian replacement, that has the earthworks of the original village behind it, the original settlement. So fonts were retrieved, they were reused, they were important elements in terms of people's response to their place in the Christian community. They were not discarded. I mean, carvings on churches churches did reuse stonework and so on, but the font as an entity seems to have been treasured and preserved where possible. Now, one of the things we're looking at is the way in which these fonts were made. Now, here we've got one at Bainton. Now, this diamond pattern that we've seen, of course, at Durham, these geometric patterns require setting out with instruments and skill to make certain that the pattern repeats properly round the drum and comes out without a mismatch at the end. And so this, and the other thing, of course, to remember is that these fonts were made from very large, very heavy blocks of stone. And so they had to be carefully measured. The weight of the stone was reduced by hollowing out the center. But they were still enormously heavy objects. And of course, they had to be, in theory, they were cylindrical, although very many of the fonts in the smaller churches are not quite true cylinders. The idea of turning one of these on a lathe, which is one suggestion for making columns, I think would be a bit of a strain on the lathe. Now, again, here we have the font at Weaverthorpe, and again, you have the geometric patterns. And this must have taken some working out, because you have a different set of geometry in the different sections of the font. So that would have been set out rather carefully. And it seems, as you go around it, it seems to match. Now, later fonts, almost certainly later, I say this is the font from North Newbold. It's thought that there were two phases of building at North Newbold, an earlier one and a later one, still in the 12th century. And this is probably associated with the later stage of building. Now, these fonts on clustered shafts require not only a wide piece of stone, but a very tall one. This is all one piece of stone. There is no join. So the weight of that stone being carried, it was probably the heaviest piece of stone that was taken to the church. The way in which they were moved was by sledges drawn by oxen. And it isn't necessarily, these fonts are not necessarily made of the same stone that the church is built from. Many of them are Jurassic Oolitic limestone, and they come from one or two specific outcrops, presumably because they were easier to work. But as I say, getting them to the church in their unworked state, I think it's unlikely that, in fact, I can't imagine the circumstances in which there would have been a special workshop to make fonts. I think would have been a challenge. There is another comedy font here at Middleton on the Wolds, which again is clustered shafts and bears every appearance of being made from plasticine. Now, I'm assured it's not been retooled, but it is a remarkable, I think is the polite term, bit of design. But this is Middleton on the Wolds, and again, probably rather later than the straightforward, straight-sided cylindrical fonts. Now, we're looking, of course, and the thing that people like really enjoy looking at are the figurative fonts, because here, unlike the other fonts where the decoration in the plain fonts or the iconography or the iconographic program doesn't survive, we can see what the iconographic program was. And of course, they are rightly famous. So there are 6 fonts which survive in the East Riding with extensive figure carving. Now, 2 of them are divorced from their churches. Those 2 are Cranswick and Everingham. Now, one, which is Cottam, was removed to Langtoft Church, and there are 3 in situ for the churches for which they were made. And there's Cowlam, there's Kirkburn, and there's North Grimston. And there's, I think, a lot of people would agree that the Langtoft, Cowlam, Kirkburn, and North Grimston fonts form a group either made by the same people or in the same tradition. So we'll start off just by checking out the figure carving that you get in Norman France. This is Bayeux Cathedral, and these are the so-called Bayeux lovers. So this is the springing of an archway. And if you look, you can see this geometric treatment of the hair, the treatment of the eyes, the Romanesque pleating of the garments, and the way in which the balance of the heads and the faces is managed. And let's have a look at the other end of the spectrum, which is, sorry, here's another one. So this is a capital at a monastery, again in Normandy. This is St. Martin of Tours, cutting his cloak in half for the beggar. And again, you're looking at crisp, fairly high relief carving in good detail, and with particularly the treatment of the draperies, which is pretty characteristic. So bear that in mind, and we'll also look at the carving which preceded the Norman fonts that we're talking about. Now, this is quite an early Anglian carving. It's 2 lay people. It comes from St. Mary's Bishop Hill in York, probably 8th century. And you can see it's 2 civilians. There's a man with a horn and the man with a sword. And then rather later is the cross at Nunburnham. And again, you're looking at not all that high relief, but you're looking at these organic shapes and the repetition of the arch motif. So this is what was there and used as figurative carving. Mind you, this was not within a church, of course. It's a cross shaft, so it would have been outside. And then, bearing those in mind, let's have a look at the carving which appears on the carved fonts, the figurative fonts in East Yorkshire. Now, this is the font at Everingham Park, and I have to apologise for the fuzzy nature of the photograph. It's now in an unknown location. It was sold in 2006. And it is now in a private collection somewhere, and we don't know where. But here it is in its position in the great Catholic chapel at Everingham, whence we believe well, it was removed for sale, but apparently, and again, we're not entirely sure, but it seems to have come from the parish church at Everingham, which was rebuilt by John Carr at a bit later than Everingham Hall. So if this was, in fact, at the Everingham Church, you can imagine the 18th century gathering their skirts about them and going, ooh, because it doesn't look like the sort of thing that an 18th century church builder would want to have in their nice, tidy church. So anyway, it landed up at the chapel at Everingham. And the scene this side, and I'm not going to try and interpret it, I'll simply tell you what the carvings probably are. We'll do a bit of interpretation later on, but this is a man on a horse. There are 2 perdrixes, partridges. These are hounds. They have collars on. That is probably a deer, and that's probably a boar. So I'm fairly simple-minded. That suggests to me a hunting scene. And on the other side, we have a man with a bow and arrow and a wolf. So on the face of it, that looks like a depiction of a hunt. But of course, there are interpretations that you could put on it if you were wanting to align it with Christian doctrine. As I say, we don't know where that is now. It was sold and it's disappeared into a private collection. However, we do know where the Hutton Cranswick font is, and that's now in Hull Museum. Now, this has arcading, and it has very low relief carving. Now, this low relief you'll see in one or two of the fonts that we're going to look at later. So here we have the Agnus Dei, and here we have a man with a bow and arrow, and here we have a man who looks as if he's carrying his head. I'm not sure, since the top seems to have been damaged in some way, how that particular image works. Here we have, going round that font, I would like to think that that was a bell ringer, although whether or not that is the case, I don't know. But there he is pulling away on two ropes. That looks like two bells. It may or may not be. Here, however, we have the same imagery that we get at Cowlam, which is always interpreted as two men wrestling. Now, it's either that or it's the kiss of peace. So, you know, who knows which it is. But as I say, that particular bit of imagery recurs at Cowlam Church. Now, we have the Wolds group of carved fonts. There are 4 of them, and they're much more detailed carving all over the font. And they're Cottam, Cowlam, Kirkburn and Grimston. Now, it's been described, of course, by various authorities as barbarous, crude, primitive, folk art, but are they? Because, of course, we're looking at them with eyes which are accustomed to classical sculpture. For nearly 1,000 years, the development of sculpture in a completely different way. But, of course, if you were looking at them with the eyes of somebody in the 11th century, then you would not know about classical or Renaissance sculpture. Your experience of what you could see would be completely different. So I think that kind of value judgment simply tells us more about ourselves than it does about the sculpture that we're about to see. And I use the word sculpture rather carefully, but it almost describes it. So we're going to start off with Cowlam, which is a little tiny church in a churchyard with the earthworks of the village behind it. And this is a narrative font, and it basically covers the early life of Christ. We'll begin with the adoration of the Magi. Now, here is the Virgin with the Christ child, with a crown, of course, and that is one of the Magi. The other 2 are round, so we'll go through the font. There's the adoration of the Magi. There's the massacre or the planning of the massacre of the innocents. There are 2 men wrestling, or alternatively, the kiss of peace, and then there's a bishop and an angel. So let's have a look at the rest of the font. So Adam and Eve and the serpent and the tree of knowledge. This is a very, very common motif on fonts for obvious reasons. This was the genesis of the human race. This is where life began, where human life began. A font would be the place to put it because this is where your Christian life begins. So we have, there's Eve with the apple, and Adam on the other side. There is the tree, the foliate carving, and here is the serpent. Now, moving on, we have Herod, King Herod with his crown and his scepter, and his henchman with his sword. So you are looking at, and we'll just move on to the next one just to show you, because he is next to, just a minute, the 3 wise men. So that's Herod round there. Here are the 3 men, the 3 wise men with their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Around there is the Virgin and child receiving the gifts. We go past Herod, and then we get to the two men, there's an angel there, two men wrestling, and a bishop. And I'm going back rather than forward, which I shouldn't be doing. So the narrative of the Cowlham font is the narrative of Christ's early life, which seems entirely appropriate since baptism is the beginning of the Christian's life, and the story would have been familiar, to everyone. Now, in a minute, I'll be talking about the suggestion made by Rita Wood, who is a great authority on Romanesque sculpture, who suggests that since some of these churches were associated with the Augustinian priories, that the canons, the Augustinian canons, may have had a hand in organizing the iconography, or even were patrons of some of these fonts. And I'll go through some of these ideas with you with the next ones. So here in the North Grimstone, this is a very unusual subject for a font. It's the Last Supper. And so it's Christ with his epistles at the Last Supper, and then it's the deposition from the cross. And then, of course, there is the bishop, a figure of a bishop, who is probably St. Nicholas, who is the patronal saint of the church. So let's start with the deposition, which is actually the end of the story. So here Christ is being taken down from the cross. That is the tail end of the Last Supper. And then here we have Christ with his hand raised in blessing. Now, one of the tremendous charms of this font and others is that the Italian ideas of perspective have not yet penetrated. So this is the table of the Last Supper. And on this table, you have loaves, you have a knife, you have fishes in a bowl, there are flagons, and each of the disciples is seated with food in front of him. And underneath, you can see their robes and their feet. This, of course, is Christ with his hand raised. And he seems to be sitting on a throne. Can you see where his feet are resting on what looks like a footrest for a much more high status chair? And carry on round until we get to the deposition. As I say, you get the flagon, you get the loaves and the fishes, and possibly consciously, this recalls to us the miracle of the loaves and fishes, as well as the Last Supper. Now, it seems to me it's not it's an opportunity you would take if you were teaching your congregation, so to speak, and using the font as a teaching aid. Now, again, this Last Supper theme is a very, very unusual one for a font. In fact, there's almost nothing on this font which suggests baptism or rebirth. It's the other end of the Christ story. And here we have the bishop. Now, here we have on the tower of the church, this is reset, a figure of a bishop, because this is the stonework here is later. And here we have the bishop, which is on the font. Now, I would hazard a guess that that is St. Nicholas, who is the patronal saint of the church. But of course, it's almost impossible to identify bishops. There's a generic bishop which is carved, and you have to try and make an educated guess. The other thing to note, of course, is that the arcading is still there. So you're looking at figures within arcades. They separate out the elements of the story. It's almost like a chapter in a book, or a cartoon with different episodes in different on different pages. So that's North Grimstone. Now here we have a very interesting font, because here at Langtoft, And I shall be talking a bit about the way in which these fonts were made and who made them, because this is one of the churches where we've got a little bit of evidence which suggests that the fonts were made, or this particular font was made, by the people who were actually building the church. So this font came from Cottam, which is the lost village just across the valley from both Cowlam, is 2 miles away from Cowlam, and about 1.5 miles away from Langtoft. And this font has, again, it has Adam and Eve, which you can see here. It also has a very unusual series of Christian martyrs. So there's St. Andrew's martyrdom on the cross, there's St. Margaret of Antioch, and there's St. Lawrence, he of the gridiron. So here we have Adam and Eve, and again, you know, the beginning, the genesis of life, which of course baptism is for a Christian. This is the martyrdom of St. Andrew, the brother of St. Peter, and like St. Peter, crucified on a different shaped cross from Christ. Here we have the wonderful legend of St. Margaret of Antioch. Now, she was swallowed by a dragon, and you can see her here being swallowed, but the dragon, because she was so holy, his belly burst open and she popped out through his belly. So there she is popping out, although by the look of it, leaving her head. I mean, this is the time lapse doesn't work here. This is her going in, this is her coming out. So this is the martyr, and she was later martyred, of course, but she was a very popular saint in the early and later Middle Ages. And here we have St. Lawrence on his gridiron, being poked by his executioner. He was slowly roasted on both sides. And if I were making a joke in the worst possible taste, I would say he was the patron saint of barbecues, but I won't. So there we are. But he's you know, these 3 choices, St. Lawrence, St. Andrew, St. Margaret of Antioch, seem to me odd choices for a font. This is a font from Cottam, just up the road from Cowlam. What was it that produced these choices? You know, why was that particular iconography chosen? They're all making sacrifices for their religion, but then martyrs do. And for a font, which is the beginning of life as a Christian, it seems a rather gloomy outlook. But the other thing about this font is this. So here is the tree of life, which is and again, you've got arcading, can you see, which is enclosing each of the episodes. Now that is the tree of life. And the other thing that came from Cottam to Langtoft is this. Now, I have had to outline in pencil because the light is so bad in that church that when I took the photograph, you couldn't really get the relief. So I had to outline it in pencil. But here, this is the door lintel from Cottam. And it is the Agnus Dei. It's only half of it. And you can see this little hole, which probably represents the centre. You've got the foliate carving here. And then over the top of the Agnus, and then coming down on the other side where his head would probably be a matching carving. Now, I think that the hand that made that would be perfectly capable of making the font. And so, again, you know, suggesting that the people who made the fonts perhaps also worked on the carvings within the church. Now, one of the things about these things being called crude and barbarous is the nationality of the carvers. Now, I think we know, of course, that the Norman lords came over, but I don't know of very much evidence for Norman peasants, not that we know very much about the working people of Normandy at that period. Apart from anything else, they didn't speak English. So I suspect that all of this work would have been done by native workmen rather than importing. I mean, okay, so you import a chap from Normandy if you want to build a Norman church, How is he going to tell the native carvers what to do? He doesn't speak the language. I think it's certainly for these country churches as opposed to big cathedrals, it's much more likely that the work was done by local or native masons. And finally, and this is where we start to talk about Rita Wood and her ideas about how the font was used as a vehicle for ideas about the Christian condition and the Christian story, which were put around, were suggested by the Augustinians, who of course provided parish priests, they were canons. And here, this is the Kirkburn, which is an amazing church, and this font is divided, as you can see, into two registers. Now, the top register is the, so to speak, the heavenly register, but the bottom register is the register for, as it were, the human, the lower, the baser life. So here we have the ascension, and here is Christ in the mandorla, and he's rising to heaven. Underneath is the Agnus Dei. Now, on that side, it's a bit indistinct, but you can see the man with the axe. And on this side, and we'll see later, there is a man with a club leading an animal to slaughter. And that iconography, I think, is probably fairly obvious to us all. Here we have baptism. And here, and this rather glum child is being totally immersed in the font. Here is the Holy Ghost, the dove. Here is, this is a candle and a book. Now, I'd suggest that that means that that figure is John the Evangelist, who brought the light of Christianity, and he's always shown carrying a book. And that light of Christianity would be lighting on that child at baptism. Underneath, there is a cat chasing a mouse. And again, the suggestion is that that is us being led into sin, from which baptism is supposed to save us. And then on this side, here is the man leading to slaughter. It's meant to be a bull, but I've never seen a bull with a bushy tail before. And here you have certainly a named saint, because you can see the keys of St. Peter. So St. Peter is being handed the keys to the kingdom. So here you have, if Rita Wood is correct, an interpretation which suggests that on the upper register, you're looking at the Christian condition, the Christian story, the way in which the Christian sacraments and saints will save you. And on the lower register, you're looking at the baser, the human element. So that is Kirkburn font. Now, they're all open to the public, although at the moment Cowlham is, their electrics are playing up and they're desperate for money, so please give them some money so that they can open the church again, because health and safety won't let them. But I'm going to finish with this. And this is the much later building, of course, of Cotton Church, and we've just seen at Langtoft. And here are the earthworks of the township that it served. And from those tofts and crofts and buildings, people brought their children to be baptized for hundreds and hundreds of years. I mean, the font wasn't moved until the early 1950s. And meanwhile, this church had been rebuilt, but it was still operating as a church. So from this landscape came those fonts, those introductions to the Christian life. And we see today, I suppose, in a sense, the ghosts of what they were, because when they were painted and you had the full glory of their iconography, you would probably have been able to make even more sense of them than we can today. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions if I can.
Right. Are there any questions? Can't hear anyone.
Well, can you hear me, Barbara English?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. And of course, they're very dear to my heart, being in East Riding. Rita Wood died this winter. I don't know if you knew that.
Yes, I
And
did.
she was such a incredibly detailed researcher, everything. We really miss her, I think.
Yes.
I have a sort of footnote about Everingham, which is all second-hand, I think, and might be considered slanderous, but this is what I
Do
knew.
go ahead. Do go ahead.
I'll go ahead. I knew, and some of you would have known Henry Stapleton, who was the faculty giver outer for York Diocese for a long time. They went off to be Dean of Connaught. He was the rector of Everingham, and this story, I think, started probably with him, and Rita comes into it. That the village decided they didn't like their font because it was barbaric, as you said. And in fact, Pesner says they're barbaric, doesn't he?
Yes, that's right.
Very strange of him. I thought he would like them. Anyway, so they put when the Catholic Duke of Norfolk's family, Lady Anne Hard, I think she was called, when she went to live in Everingham and got this chapel, the font from the village church had been put into the Catholic chapel. And they didn't accept it, I think, as a font, so they kept their umbrellas in it. And then she began to sell off things from the chapel, and she sent the font to Sotheby's in New York.
Yes, that's right.
And Rita and I, and many others, probably you, Jane, tried to stop it getting a license because it seemed to us outrageous that a village font, even if it wasn't in the church, be sent to Sotheby's, and it was sold for 50,000, I'm not sure now, pounds or dollars, to an American collector who probably keeps umbrellas in it, if not whiskey. And we, as you say, we have no idea quite when. But then